In the last lecture, we started adding our child routes, and now loading the recipe detail component doesn't work anymore. The reason for this is that here we use recipe all over the place, and that's a property of this component, but it's a property set through property binding with add input in front of it, so it awaits to be set from outside the component. Since this component is set through routing though, this won't work anymore. So we have to change how we receive the recipe here, how we set the recipe. And we can change it because keep in mind, in our route, which we define here, we pass this ID, which is a dynamic parameter. So we should be able to load a recipe by the ID, which will simply refer to the position in the array of recipes. So here is your challenge. Try fixing the recipe detail component to somehow use that ID to update the recipe which is displayed to fetch it from the recipe service. Of course, you will need to implement some method in the recipe service which allows you to get that. Here is your chance to pause the video. Thereafter, I will solve it together with you. So, were you successful? Let's fix it together. In the recipe detail component, we clearly can remove add input because that's not how we receive the value anymore. So we can also remove the import of add input. That of course also means, before we forget it, that in the recipe item component, we can remove the onSelected click listener here because that will not be how we pass the value anymore. And of course we could also remove the onSelected method here. That is something we don't need anymore. Of course, that also allows us to remove the recipe service from this component and remove the import. So we're cleaning up quite a lot here. In the recipe list component, we don't have to change anything. And in the recipe component itself here, we already did make a change and add the router outlet. So now in the recipe detail component, we somehow need to get our single recipe. And we know that we will get the ID from the router. So let's first fetch this ID. And you learned that for this, we need to get access to the activated route. So let's inject it here of type activated route. Make sure to add this import here from addAngularRouter. This import is important to enable TypeScript to identify the type you're trying to inject here, and with that Angular is able to use it. So now we get this route, and now we have two ways of retrieving the ID. The first one would be to simply bind it to this route snapshot params ID. But this will only work for the first time we load a detail component. Now keep in mind, the menu where we can click on one is on the left. So we will be able to choose a new recipe whilst we still see the details of another one. So we probably want to react to changes in our recipe ID because that's absolutely possible in our app. So that is not the approach I want to use. Instead, what I want to do is I want to use my route, the params observable, and subscribe to that observable. Now with that, we can react to any changes in our route params, and we will get them here of type params as we learned to be imported from addAngularRouter. And now we can really react to a new ID. So we should probably store that ID here in a property of our class. It will be of type number. So we should set this ID equal to params ID, though we know that what we get back here will be a string. So we should cast it to a number by adding a plus in front of it. So now we will have an ID in the form of a number, which we can use to identify our recipe. Well, with this information, we want to load our recipe from the recipe service, and for that we need to change our recipe service because right now we got no way of loading a single recipe by ID. That's something we can easily implement though. We can simply implement a getRecipe method, which takes an ID of type number, and then we can simply return this recipes and select the item at this index. We could also rename ID to index to make really clear what that number will be in the end. You could also call slice before doing that, because slice would now give you a copy of your array, though it won't be a deep copy, so the objects still are the same anyways, so you can also directly return the object like this. You could, of course, also create a hard copy of that object with object assign, for example. That's not what I want to do here though, so we return a single recipe. Now back in the recipe detail component TypeScript file, after fetching an ID and storing it, I want to fetch the new recipe. And I will later also show why I needed to store the ID here. So let's fetch the recipe using our recipe service whenever the ID changes. Then I will call getRecipe and pass my ID as an argument. And with that, we should be able to indeed make our application to work again. By going manually to recipes 0, we indeed see the detail view for the schnitzel and with 1 for the burger. So that is working. Now we also need to enable these links here to work again, because right now they're not doing anything. With our child routes added in the last lecture, let's now make these links work again so that we can really choose an item from that list. The place to make these links work, of course, is in our recipe list, the recipe item here. That is where we have the anchor tag, and that is where we should set the link. We can set a link with router link, but now we get a dynamic segment in the path. So now I will bind router link with squared brackets, because now I want to pass this array which allows me to really configure segment for segment of my path. Now the first segment is also the only segment that will be the ID I want to load. So I will use a relative path because this element here, the list, already is loaded at /recipes. So whenever I just add the ID here, that is already all I want, because then we're going to end up at recipes/ID. Now, to get the ID, I need to pass this extra information to the recipe item component. We're not doing this right now, so let's do that. I will add a new property binding here. So I will add the index here, and the index will simply be a number, and I will add input at the beginning. With this, I can now pass in the index of this item from outside, and I'll do this from the recipe list component. Here, besides sending the recipe itself, I can now also pass the index, and of course I have to retrieve that from my ng for loop. So here I'll simply bind I to index to get the index of of each iteration basically. And then I'll pass this index I to the app recipe item and bind it to the index property there, this property we just created. As a side note, with the ID being passed to this component now, you theoretically could update this component to now use our recipe service and the getRecipe method we just created to fetch the recipe by ID. But I will leave it as it is here, but that would be one way of refactoring or restructuring this component. The important thing for us now is that we have the index property in this component now. And that is all we need for this link. So I want to pass the index here, and keep in mind, this is for a single component, so that index will be different for each instance of this component. So if we save this, we can see it already at the bottom of the page. This looks all right. And I can switch between 0 and 1. So that looks pretty good. Now it would also be nice to style the active item here though. And that is something I'll do in the next lecture. In the last lecture, we made our child routes links here work again. Now let's make clear which one is selected by marking it. We can mark the active link by adding, manually, the active class to it. If we do this, all are marked as active, because of course it's added to every instance of this component, because I hard-coded it in there. So that's the right class, but of course we should add it dynamically with good old router link active directive. And here I simply want to pass active as the class name because we just saw this is the CSS class we need to add. And with that, it's working as expected. And this is all we needed here. You also see that recipes is still marked as active at the top because we still are at /recipes and then at a child route, but that doesn't matter for this to be marked as active because it's not set to exact matching, and actually we want the behavior we have right now. So that all looks pretty good. Now we can move on to make sure that we can click this new recipe button and this edit recipe button and actually do something once we do click them. So with child routing almost finished, let's make sure that we can create new recipes and that we can edit the existing ones. So for this, we need a new component. So let's generate this first. I'll use the CLI again with nggc, and I want to store it in the recipes folder. And here I will name it recipe edit. And I don't want to create this spec file, which is why I set it to false. So with this, if I shrink down the other files, we get this new recipe edit folder here with the recipe edit component. We'll work on the content of this file after the forms section, but I already want to load it and I want to retrieve the route parameter. So to load this, what I will do is I will go to my app routing module and I will register a new route here. The first route is for a new recipe. So maybe new would be a good path so that we have /recipes/new in the end. And with that, we could load our recipe edit component here. And of course, you need to add the import here from the newly created recipes/recipe edit folder. Also make sure that it was added to the app module. And this is done automatically as always by the CLI, but you need to ensure that it is added to declarations and as an import here at the top to have it work correctly and to be able to load it. So with that added here, we have our new recipe route. Now I'll duplicate it to also have a :id/edit route maybe, so that we have the ID available in this route because we need to load it. But I want to have a /edit at the end so that it's clear that we're in edit mode. And this is the same component. That's also the recipe edit component. I will, in the component, determine whether we are in edit mode or not. Now with this setup here, if we go back to the application and we enter /edit after this, we see recipe edit works. So that's great. But we will see something maybe unexpected if I try to go to /recipes/new. Now we try to load the detail component and therefore we get an error because it basically failed to get a recipe with the ID new. And that's exactly what went wrong here. If we visit recipes/new, due to the way how we ordered our routes, it will try to parse new as an ID. Because the route with the dynamic ID parameter comes before the route definition where we have new hard-coded into the path. So we should switch these two routes so that the new route comes before the route with the dynamic parameter. Otherwise, how would Angular know if whatever we passed right now should be interpreted as the new hard-coded path or as a dynamic parameter? So with this order, now we should be able to load new without any issues. If we hit enter, that looks all right, and we can also still load the existing recipes. So with that, these paths are set up too. The missing piece is now to retrieve the ID in the recipe edit component and to determine whether we are in edit mode or not.